looks like we're rolling. Let's do this. It's that douchebag in a muscle shirt again. Trying to keep it up weekly. Well, hope everybody had a good week. If anybody actually watches this, I get some views that I know are not me, so somebody's at least checking it out. I don't know, but anyway. Anyway, maybe someday somebody will see this, even if, yeah, maybe this will take off someday, maybe it won't. Is what it is. Anyway, trying to keep this up weekly. So my thoughts today, a few weeks ago, we talked about why the Nazis kind of hated Slavic people, especially the Russians in particular, the kind of the Poles too, a lot. And so that gave me, and I took a little break from the history stuff, but that gave me the idea that a lot of people in the United States, kind of in the world in general, don't know enough about what happened in those on the Eastern Front in those dark days in World War II. Yeah, we're talking the war between the Axis powers and the Soviet Union in particular. Yeah, just, I used to, I've just, over the years, I've talked to people who maybe, and it's maybe even people who know a halfway decent amount of stuff about America and the Western Allies and America versus Japan, yada yada, and they don't know a lot about the Eastern Front. And to me, the Eastern Front, the conflict between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, was the most interesting part of the war because it's where the most death happened. It was, yeah, so, yeah. So I'll start digging into my notes a little bit here now before I go off on some tangent. But yeah, the most death happened on the Eastern Front. It was the largest invasion of a country in history. It was the Germans went in on a massive scale, and what a lot of people don't know, this was Operation Barbarossa is what it was called, and what a lot of people don't know is it wasn't just Germany. They kind of assembled a coalition. They had so most people know World War II, Nazi Germany was allied with Italy and Japan. So but there were other allies, other signatures of the Axis treaty, and they also had a few allies that weren't officially part of the Axis, yada yada. But when they invaded the Soviet Union, they had support and troops from Italy, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and Finland did not sign the Axis, but they fought on their side on the side of Germany to a limited degree as co-belligerents because of the incidences that happened in the Winter War, which created bad feelings between the Soviet Union and Finland, obviously. Bulgaria also was on with the Axis, although their role was pretty limited. In addition to those nations, Yugoslavia got split up, and there were Croatians fighting on both the sort of anti-Nazi and pro-Nazi side, and some Croatians, kind of a significant amount, although Croatia itself I don't think was officially on that side, but a lot of Croatians ended up in Stalingrad in particular. So, and there were a few Spanish, not very many, but I think it was called like the Blue Army, the Blue something. There's a few Spanish volunteers went in on the side of the Germans. A small number, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands had been taken over. A small number of Scandinavian and Dutch people, after being taken over by Germany, kind of switched sides and or for various reasons volunteered and fought on that side. So there was although I will say, in the case of the Scandinavians, it was a pretty small number. It was a little unit called the Viking Brigade. Maybe a couple tens of thousands of people. On the scale of the Eastern Front, it was pretty small. But yeah, it was not just Germany. This idea Germany stood alone against them. No, they had allies. They had allies. Romania alone sent in. By the end of the war, when it was all said and done, they had sent out 1 million troops. I believe it was 1.2 million to assist the Germans in their invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, that said, this is, of course, all Germany's idea, and Germany was the economic backbone of the whole operation. Obviously, Hungary and Romania, they were not, especially back in those days, they were not in good industrial situations necessarily, so they depended a lot on Germany to supply them, to supply their troops. But the point is, it was not Germany alone. Germany allied with various other countries that either had pro-fascist leaderships, or, as in the case of Finland, they weren't really fascist, but they had been threatened by the Soviet Union, and they believed that they were forced to choose between two evils, and they, chose the one that seemed right to them at the time. So, yeah, so it was not just Germany, the major one, obviously, yada yada, but not just Germany. It was an Axis coalition. So, 7 minutes already I've been talking. So, and why did they invade the Soviet Union? That is a question that is debated, and you'll get different opinions, different answers why, but there's a lot of different reasons. I talked about in the last one the racism against Slavic people, and especially kind of the further east you go, the kind of more alien they seemed from the perspective of like Western Europeans or whatever. That factored in. The growing power of the Soviet Union was a big part of it. The growing power and aggressive expansionism of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had invaded Finland. They had taken over a little bit of Romania. They were kind of stabbing westward. So that was a concern, obviously, to the Germans and other nations, which is why some of these other nations seemingly made a deal with the devil, so to speak, because they were like, hey, we gotta make a choice between two evils here. So, and the world, that was kind of the attitude of the world in parts of Europe at that time. You got to choose this or that. Hard to be gray, hard to sit on the fence. Hard to sit on the fence, and neither options were looking good, frankly. So, also, I want to mention, if you want a real history guy, not just some douchebag in a muscle shirt who likes to yep. There's a guy called Tick History. For a long time, he was just known as Tick, Tik, Tick History. Now, I don't agree with everything that he says, necessarily. He's kind of an ANCAP, and okay, there's some legitimate things in that, and maybe some things that are debatable, yada yada. But yeah, he did a video. Maybe I'll even link it in the description, but we'll see. He did a video about oh yeah, it was about the shrinking markets hypothesis. This idea that anyway, the shrinking market that's more complicated than I can get into, but the shrinking markets hypothesis may have been a significant factor in why the Nazis wanted to go east. Oil played a huge role. You've got lots of oil in the east, and this is kind of related to the shrinking markets hypothesis. Yeah, there's this idea that the Germans had to expand and grow, like sort of grow or die idea, and they needed the food and resources and land to expand themselves. And then that tied into their racism, like we are the people who should grow, not them, kind of thing. So a lot of different reasons, also geopolitical stuff that's more complicated than I can get into here. But yeah, so they went east, and the army that they went east with was, like I said, the biggest invasion in the history of the world. Nothing's ever quite been seen like that. The Germans had went in with anywhere between 3 and 4, maybe up to 4.5 million soldiers, coming out, invading the Soviet Union. And then their allies that was another million, maybe 1.5 million. So we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 million, possibly a 6 million strong invasion force into the biggest country on earth, a multinational coalition setting about to try and destroy the Soviet Union in 1941. So that's yeah, it was massive, and this is why I think it's the most interesting. All I got is my notes here, so I don't remember exact dates. It was 1941. It was before Britain was in the war. America was not in the war yet. I believe was it August? It was. I wish I should remember the month. It's like I know the month, but I can't think of it. It was like summer, early or spring, 1941. Anyway, that's but 1941 mid-year is when we're talking about when this all went down, and and yeah, what a lot of people don't appreciate about the numbers, the Soviet Union at the time. Okay, obviously the Soviet Union has a massive population, a bigger population than Germany, probably a bigger population than all of Germany's allies put together. But when you look at the militaries involved, there's this idea that like the only reason, and there's some grains of truth. A lot of times there's grains of truth to these myths, yada yada. But there's this idea the only reason the Soviet Union won is because they were so massively outnumbered, but the Germans were the more professional military. Grains of truth. But when you look at Barbarossa, the first part of the war, Soviet military wasn't. It was big. It was one of the bigger militaries on the planet, maybe even the biggest. But compared to all this coalition, etc., they were outnumbered. There was maybe, now according to some records, there was like less than 2 million armed force, like in the army. I think that's not counting Navy, Air Force, but however, that's probably a low count. It was probably at least 3 million total that the Soviet military had, but look at how big the Soviet Union. You can't just have all your troops in one area. So they did have most in Europe, but it was probably about 2 million or so in Europe, and then like in Europe able to possibly scramble and face the threat, and then another million, in Central Asia, further east, keeping an eye on Japan, looking at the Middle East, because what if Britain tries something there? They couldn't just have all their troops. Most of the troops were in Europe, but they couldn't just have everything in Europe because it's a big country and they got a lot of interests in other areas. So this is a big reason why the Soviets took such massive casualties at the beginning. Why it's part of the reason they failed. There's other stuff going on, which I'll touch on a bit, but yeah, there's this kind of imagination I think that people have that they had this the Russians just always had this such massive army and this is always all just numbers, blah blah blah. But yeah, at the beginning, the reason they lost so much territory so quickly, so many people died, so many soldiers died, they were actually outnumbered like somewhere between 2 and 3 to 1. In addition to that, they had the element of surprise big time. The Luftwaffe went and attacked the Soviet. The Soviets didn't have a very good air force or anything, but they did have an air force somewhat significant. The Luftwaffe pretty much just blew like 90% of their air force out of the water before it could even get off the ground and engage. They were blowing up, tanks and positions left and right before the Soviets even knew what was going on. And on top of this, Hitler was writing letters to Stalin, yeah, dear my buddy Stalin, because they had been, allies previously when they invaded Poland together. He was saying, hey, my buddy Stalin, you might hear some stuff going on. You know what? That's a mistake. Don't do nothing. And for a while, Stalin believed him, and he was actually told, okay, this is a misunderstanding, sit tight, while the biggest invasion in history is going. So it took the Soviets all to figure out, this isn't a mistake, this is not cool. So I shouldn't laugh because I'm talking about some tragic shit, but I mean, what, too soon? It's like 90 years later, So can we laugh about it now a little bit, Uh, I don't know. Like the Holocaust, funny thing. No, no. Anyway, um, but but really, military stuff aside, the stuff that happened to the civilians in the former Soviet Union was a massive tragedy. So, as a result of the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union, approximately 27 million deaths throughout the course of the war occurred. Now, not all of that was combat. There was approximately 10 million military and paramilitary, I believe, deaths. So that leaves us with approximately 17 million civilians, innocent people, just trying to live their lives, caught up in a war, and now this includes people, the 17 million, roughly, give or take a few million, because when you get into this kind of millions, it gets foggy. But when of that 17 million, this includes people who died of disease and starvation. So not all of that 17 million was people getting massacred, but serious, terrible atrocities went on. Sometimes the Nazis would just liquidate villages, let's just kill everybody here to make sure we don't have insurgents. Due to their racist stuff, they were like, F these people, we can just wipe them out. We plan to liquidate and replace, was kind of the plan. very, very evil stuff going on. And I don't think it gets talked about enough, frankly, in history. Obviously, you don't want to talk about it like, in. I guess I get why people don't talk about it in casual conversations. Did you hear about all the Russians that died in World War? Yeah, okay, I get it, but in the context of history, in the context of everybody knows about the 6 million Jews, and they should. That should be like never again, all that. But what about this? But we don't talk enough about the Slavs. I think Eastern Europe in general. If you consider the 27 million Soviets, of which 17 were civilians, and 3 million non-Jewish Poles, plus maybe close to a million Serbians, and yeah, that's. I don't know the exact total. I don't know if there is a stat how many particularly Slavic people who speak a Slavic language died, but it's tens of millions. It's over 20 million. It's over 30 million. If you include military and other stuff. But anyway, yeah, a massive tragedy for the ages took place, and that's something I think we should be aware of just as much as the very tragic Jewish Holocaust, or the yeah. I mean, I'll just leave it at that. It's both should be notable in history. Yeah, yeah. Checking out my notes again. Yeah, I know I'm disorganized. Soviet. So yeah, so a lot of people say that Germany sort of committed suicide when they invaded the Soviet Union. It's like, dude, it's the Soviet Union. It's massive. You're gonna lose. You're as good as lost when you mess with the Russians, man. I actually don't. I understand that argument. I actually don't agree because yeah, when you look at the coalition they had and versus the manpower, the Soviet Union actually did have good tanks and a lot of tanks, kind of, but they didn't have a very good air force, navy. The manpower, they had the manpower potential big time, but they did not have the manpower there and trained. So, as they were getting invaded, losing territory, losing people left and right, civilian, military, up against a force of millions of Germans and allies of Germans, they had to scramble like mofos and to recruit, and the way they managed to do that was pretty almost miraculous, really. I mean, to the amount of people that they had to just train up, and then these people that they're training up, no, well, now they're green recruits. They're green recruits going up against seasoned Nazis, seasoned Nazis who have seen blood and death and know what they're doing, and that's another thing. A lot of people talk about the Soviets were so incompetent. They got just slaughtered. But just, well, first of all, they were outnumbered for a long time, and then when they did get their numbers up, you're talking green recruits against seasoned vets. Who do you think has the advantage? There's also a technological. It wasn't really a huge technological gap by today's standards, but Germans are pretty renowned for being technically savvy. The Soviets were behind in their industrial capacity. Stalin actually foresaw this, and he gave a speech almost like a prophetic speech, like exactly 10 years before the German invasion. He didn't think it was going to be Germany. He didn't know where it was coming from, but he was like, somebody's going to try something, and we're between 50 and 100 years behind the West, and we gotta catch up or die. And he was right. Now Stalin, not a fan of Stalin, evil guy, mass murderer, but he was right on that, and his decision to massively industrialize the Soviet Union may have saved Russia. As terrible of a man as he was, a guy who killed millions of his own people. There's an argument to be made. He saved Russia. Maybe it's true. Maybe somebody else could have done it better without putting a bunch of people in gulags. But maybe they needed. There's an argument to be had that maybe they needed the man of steel to get him in shape. I don't like Stalin, pretty evil dude, but maybe just a little sympathy for the devil on that point. So, yeah. So yeah. So and then the big yeah. So a lot of people. So some people who don't know much about the history, maybe they know the American side, but they don't know this side, will actually ask like, who killed more Nazis, the Americans or the Russians? Not even close. The Russians killed way more Nazis than the Americans. They were up against armies and armies while we were up against one army or whatever. Yeah, that they were up against armies of millions while we were up against maybe 1 million. Plus we had British Canadian allies, Free French, Free Polish, etc. Helping us out. The Soviets were just the Soviet Union, and they were up against, like I said, the massive coalition, etc. So yeah, it's not even close on that. Now that said, I don't want to diminish the American role. Certainly for a country that kind of didn't have to be there. Yeah, because we're pretty safe on the other side of the Atlantic, right? Our role in the war was massive. Our industrial role, our role in the aerial bombardments, our Air Force, our Navy, massive role. But as far as like ground troops on the ground, and we played a significant role in that. Britain played a very significant role in that too. But the point I'm getting at is the really big, massive armed conflicts, army to army, on the ground. It was all about Russia defeating Nazi Germany on the ground, essentially. And the big turning point was Stalingrad, as most people know, possibly sometimes referred to as the biggest battle in history, but there's also another battle that took place later called Kursk, but it's debatable as to if that was really one battle or several battles, so, But yeah, largest battles in history, like several of them were Soviet Union against Russia, and people like to talk about the kill ratios, saying how the Germans were a lot more competent and killed a lot more people than the Soviets. Kind of when you get into that kind of dick measuring contest of, okay, the Russians won, but the Germans pound for pound were such brilliant soldiers. Okay, there's a grain of truth, like most myths, kind of a grain of truth that the Germans were great soldiers. They, yeah, they had a better kill ratio than anybody they fought against. Better, I think the British had the second best actually. America's probably third, or tied with the Canadians or something like that. But yeah. So okay, so excluding all the civilians that died for a minute, approximately 10 million military casualties of the Soviet Union. The Germans lost about I believe it's 9.7 million in the war altogether, but that includes military and civilian. Military alone, they lost, I believe it's around 7 million. Of that 7 million, it's probably 4.5 million fighting the Soviet Union. But then you got to factor in the allies of the Germans. How many Romanians died fighting on? How many Italians? How many Hungarians? How many Finns? So when you get down to it, yes, they had a better kill. Yes, the Germans did have a better kill ratio. But like I said at the beginning, they had the Soviets massively outnumbered. Then when that situation kind of reversed and the Soviets had them outnumbered, well, they were outnumbered, but it was all these green recruits, and they were up against a professional army that was better industrialized, better trained. So I mean, really, this whole kind of like the Germans were impressive and the Soviets were unimpressive. Well, they were both impressive. I mean, the way that the Soviets, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to deny the professionalism of the German military and the way they like came close to conquering the world by some estimations. It's impressive. But what the Soviets did under pressure, under the gun, they rallied, they recruited, they kept at it, and they just would not quit. They would not give up. They kept building up their forces. They endured starvation. The city of Leningrad, which is modern day St. Petersburg. Like a million people starved to death because the Germans and the Finns blockaded it and all this. But yeah, the Russians, the Soviets, but mostly the Russians and Belarusians and Ukrainians to some extent, yeah, they fought this and very impressive. Even if their leader Stalin was bad, even if it was even if you could say like bad guy against bad guy, so to speak, massive respect to the Russian people. And this is at a time when we're not supposed to be on Russia's side. We're not supposed to sympathize with them because they're doing bad things in Ukraine. I'll be real. I'm not down with what they're doing in Ukraine. But speaking historically in World War II here, much sympathy and much respect for everything that nation and people, especially the Russians in particular, went through at the hands of mostly Germany and their allies, but it was Germany's, master plan and everything. Yeah, yeah, much. So that's kind of the point of this video. Like when we remember peoples who've died in the tragedies of war. I think the peoples of Eastern Europe broadly, and especially Russia, should be remembered in this in full context. Okay, yeah, and I could give some educated guesses about how many of those Germans died fighting the Soviets versus fighting Americans, but uh, you know, But that's I don't have the exact numbers. Okay, I'll give it a little whirl here. So out of the 7 million German military is probably, I'm gonna say probably 5 million, probably a little less than 5 million. Probably talking something like 4.8 million died on the Eastern Front fighting the Russians. However, that includes some of them starved to death, some of them froze to death. Maybe in a fight, maybe it was 3 million, but you know, yeah. But I'm kind of just speculating on that. I don't know the exact numbers. But let's talk about some. But of course, everybody knows. Hey, the Germans lost the war in the end. Of course, Germans lost, and the rest is history. But it's interesting how that history still impacts the world we live in today. And one area that impacts is Korea. Why do we have North and South Korea? Well, during World War II, of course, the United States, Britain, Canada were the Western Allies, along with Australia, a few other people. And the Soviet Union was our ally. And Japan was also involved. The United States was fighting Japan, obviously. And but we had this deal. So Soviet Union was not. They had their hands full with Germany and the allies of Germany enduring the biggest land invasion in history. But we did have a deal that once Germany was soundly defeated, that they'd give us a hand against Japan. And in retrospect, we're probably like, we shouldn't have done that, because it would have. We should have just we should have just handled it ourselves, because Russia's help with us against Japan is why we have two Koreas in part, and it might be why we have communist China, because so after defeating the Soviet Union, we we had this agreement with Russia. Okay, you're going to give us a hand with Japan now, and so they attacked Japan, which was in China and Korea, and at the exact same time we were dropping atomic bombs on Japan. Like I don't know if we coordinated with it, or that's just how they decided to do it. But at the exact same time, like an atomic, almost, I don't know if it was exact. I'm just getting it, almost exact. We were dropping the bomb, and the Russians came in with a force of 1 million troops, and took out 700,000 Japanese troops. Well, and they had these kind of and it included a few like Chinese allies, but they weren't really very loyal, and they mostly just ran. But it was like 600,000. I think it was something like 600,000 Japanese and 100,000 like allied Chinese that had switched sides or whatever. But anyway, they came in with superior tanks to what the Japanese had, and just obliterated the Japanese, who were not in the best of shape, because they had been fighting America and China and the Philippines, and their supply lines were getting low, their morale was getting low, etc., etc. It's towards the end of the war here. So the Russians came with a small number of Mongolian allies, incidentally, and just obliterated these massive forces of Japanese troops in Manchuria and North Korea, and and they took over territory, and they took over the territory of roughly what is now North Korea, and they gave the weapons that they confiscated from the Japanese to the Chinese communist forces. Because in addition to fighting against Japanese invaders, the Chinese were fighting a civil war amongst themselves. And this is very arguable, but this may have been a tipping point. A tipping point in giving this aid of weapons that they confiscated from the Japanese to the communists, plus just seeing, hey, that's the power of what like a communist country can do. That may have been a big factor in the war turning against the Chinese nationalists in favor of the Chinese communists, which might be why we have communist China today, and definitely why we have North Korea today. So yeah, this knowing where we came from, knowing the history of how it went down, it's relevant today. It's relevant today. So yeah, it's yeah. Guy named Utah Phillips once said the past didn't go anywhere. It's here. It's now. It's still relevant. Which is why I like history in my own way, and why I'm doing this kind of stuff. Wow, longest YouTube video ever. If anybody's still with me, thank you, thank you. I think I'm getting near the end here. Okay, so yeah. Yeah, just kind of one more thing about the whole. The Germans were better at fighting, had a better kill ratio. Yeah, grain of truth to that. But towards the end of the war, when the Soviets were fully mobilized and kind of had their stuff together and kind of became the classic Russian steamroller, it kind of got to be almost tit for tat towards the end of the war. It still wasn't quite tit for tat, like even towards the end of the war, the Germans still generally had a better kill ratio, but far from the numbers early in the war, it got to where it was pretty close to tit for tat. And an interesting example of that is Finland. Finland made a separate peace with the Soviet Union, and most people know about the Winter War, how the Finns technically lost the war and lost a little bit of territory, but the kill ratio was like the Finns killed 6 Soviets to every one Finn that got killed. But in like kind of, but then at the end of the war, when the Russians came back and retook that territory, because the Finns like lost the territory, took it back, lost it again. Towards the end of World War II, when they lost that territory again and made their separate peace with the Russians, they pieced out before the rest of the war was happening. The like second phase of the war, the Soviets actually killed slightly more Finns, which tells you something about how their technology and generalship, the quality of their general and technology and soldiers had improved, had been transformed by the events of World War II into a serious fighting force. It was no longer, the backwards Russian thing and all that. They were a force to be reckoned with by the end of the war. Sort of forged in the furnace of war. They got there. And there's kind of an interesting parallel with Yugoslavia. Most of Eastern Europe got steamrolled and taken over by the Soviets, but Finland managed to peace out with the Soviet Union, and they became neutral. They didn't join NATO. They're joining it now because of this Ukraine stuff, but yeah, they didn't join NATO. But yeah, after World War II, they didn't join NATO. Now we're neutral. And they were kind of this like, we're neutral, but west-leaning. We're a democracy. We're more towards that side, but we're neutral. And then Yugoslavia kind of did the opposite thing. They resisted. They went communist, but they said, okay, we're communist, but we don't want to be, we don't want to be under Stalin and all that shit. So they were that neutral but communist leaning thing. I just think it's kind of interesting that, you know, the sort of parallel there with Yugoslavia and Finland. But anyway, oof duh. We are getting towards the end, so I'm just gonna kind of recap and look at my notes and recap here. Is the largest invasion. Yeah, I gave my little shout out to Tick. Talked about how for some parts of the war, the Soviets were actually the ones outnumbered. Obviously, towards the end, that was not the case, but towards the beginning, Barbarossa and all that, contrary to what people think about the Soviets being like just these hordes of people. Beginning of the war, yeah, not so much. Talked about Kursk, talked about Yugoslavia, talked about Korea. Oh yeah, yeah. It's another thing that makes me interested in this Eastern Front stuff is when you look at the Soviet Union, man, or the Russian Empire leading into the Soviet Union, Russia in the early 20th century. Oh my God, so much death. Like a few million died in World War One, and then they went into Civil War, which led to the communists taking over, and then Stalin takes over. One of the biggest mass murders of all time. So you got a war, a big war, another big war, Stalin putting people into gulags where they just died, and also putting people against the wall and all that. And then the Nazis invade. Just the amount of people who died in the early 20th century, early and mid 20th century in the former Russian Empire and Soviet Union just boggles the mind that they even survived as a people to still be around to this day. So, yeah, very, very macabrely interesting. And yeah, I just want to say, disagree with Russians. Slava Ukraini, respect to the Ukrainians, but still hate. Okay, so disagree with Putin, maybe even hate Putin. Definitely hate Putin. How about that? But respect to the Russian people. The Russian people are strong, and we should have some appreciation for their history and what they've been through. And yeah, I think that's what I want to say. Way longer than I thought. Actually, I thought this would be a long one, but a bit longer than I thought. But yeah, thank you for watching if you made it this far. Maybe take a couple bites out of it. Maybe some people will take a couple bites out of it. If anybody watches this someday. Anyway, let's pray for a peaceful outcome in Ukraine and douchebag signing out.